Trey Matthews had always been told to keep his head down. It wasn't just his mom who said it, though. In his neighborhood, speaking up too much could get you in trouble. The world wasn't made for people like him, and that was something Trey knew all too well. He learned early on to move quietly, walk with his head down, and keep his voice low. It wasn't that he wanted to be invisible, it was just safer that way. But safety didn't always work. At school, Trey was one of the only black students, and no matter how quiet he was, he couldn't escape the looks, the whispers, or the occasional outburst of blatant racism. Most people didn't even realize they were doing it. Microaggressions slipped out like they were part of everyday conversation. Wow, you're so articulate for a black guy. Or you're really good at math for someone like you. But it wasn't just the comments that hurt. It was the feeling of being stuck. Of being seen as different every single day and not knowing how to make it stop. Sometimes it felt like his entire existence was built on the foundation of their assumptions about him. Trey wasn't weak, though. He had a quiet strength. He just hadn't found his voice yet. It was during lunch when things started to escalate. Chris was one of the most popular kids at school. He was the type of guy who didn't have to try. He was loud, always surrounded by his friends, and his confidence made him untouchable. But there was something about Trey that seemed to irritate him, something that made Chris go out of his way to make his life harder. It started with small things, little jabs here and there. At first, Trey tried to let it slide. Chris would say something in passing like, "Hey, Matthews, you sure you're in the right place?" Or, "Don't trip, I'd hate to see you hurt yourself running around." But the comments didn't stay small for long. One day, Chris shoved Trey while walking past in the hall. It wasn't an accidental bump either. Chris made sure to push him hard enough to make him stumble, the sound of it echoing in the otherwise quiet corridor. Chris and his friends laughed. "Stay down, monkey," Chris said, smirking as he walked off. The words stung harder than the shove. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time it felt like something inside Trey broke. He didn't know what to do. Should he say something? Should he fight back? The silence in his mind was deafening. He didn't have the answers, not yet. And so he did what he always did. He kept his head down. But that night, something was different. Trey lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the moment in his mind over and over. The words Chris had said, the laughter, the feeling of his stomach sinking into the pit of his body. He couldn't sleep. The silence felt heavier than ever. For the first time in a long time, Trey felt like he couldn't just let it go. He wanted to scream. He wanted to stand up for himself. But how? He was stuck between two worlds. The world that told him to stay quiet and let it slide, and the part of him that was tired of hiding, tired of being pushed around. The days following the incident with Chris were a blur for Trey. He went through the motions, school, homework, sleep, but nothing felt the same. The weight of the shove, the cruel words, and the laughter that echoed in his ears made every moment feel like it was dragging him deeper into a hole. Trey had always been the quiet kid. He didn't like to make waves. He thought if he just kept his head down long enough, things would eventually get better. But now he wasn't so sure anymore. Each time he walked into school, the memories of that moment with Chris came rushing back. Trey could feel the stares of his classmates, but it was different now. They weren't just looking at him, they were watching him, waiting to see how he'd respond. Would he keep his head down and let it happen again? Or would he finally stand up for himself? As the days passed, the tension kept building. Trey found himself avoiding the hallways where Chris usually hung out, avoiding the lunchroom, even avoiding his own reflection in the mirror. But then something unexpected happened, something small but meaningful. Olivia. Olivia was one of the few people who had never treated Trey differently. She didn't see his race, or at least, not in the way everyone else did. She saw him. Just Trey. The guy who sat next to her in history class, who laughed at her corny jokes, and who always helped her out when she needed it. Olivia could tell something was wrong the minute she saw Trey walking down the hallway after gym class. His usual confident stride was gone, replaced with a slow, almost defeated pace. She wasn't the type to ignore it. Without thinking, she caught up with him. "Hey, you all right?" Olivia asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Trey didn't want to talk. Not now. Not about this. But Olivia didn't back down. She stopped in front of him, blocking his path. "Come on, Trey. I can tell something's going on," she said. "If you don't want to talk about it, I get it. but you can't just keep letting them do this to you. You're better than that. Trey took a deep breath, the words caught in his throat. For a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath. He could feel the weight of everything, the teasing, the pushing, the judgment, pressing down on him. I don't know what to do, Liv, Trey admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. They just keep getting to me, and I don't know how to make it stop. Olivia's face softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to fight them by yourself, Trey. You've got me, and you've got your voice. Don't let them take that away from you. For the first time in days, Trey felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a complete change, but it was something. Olivia believed in him, and maybe, just maybe, he could start believing in himself too. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and the students began to shuffle back to their classes. But for Trey, something had changed. He no longer felt like the invisible kid in the back of the room. He wasn't sure if he was ready to stand up to Chris yet, but for the first time, he knew he wasn't alone. Trey couldn't sleep that night. The words from Olivia replayed in his mind over and over. You've got your voice. But what if his voice wasn't enough? What if standing up only made things worse? The next day at school, the air felt thick with anticipation. Trey tried to keep his head down, hoping to get through the day without incident. But deep down, he knew he couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. Sooner or later, he would have to face Chris. The moment came in the cafeteria. Trey had just grabbed his lunch, trying to find a seat. He looked around for a table, one that wasn't already filled with whispering kids, casting glances his way. His stomach was tight, the usual unease returning, but there was something different about today. Maybe it was Olivia's words, maybe it was the simmering anger that had been building in him for weeks. Either way, Trey was ready to sit somewhere where he could breathe. But as fate would have it, he didn't get the chance. Just as Trey approached an empty seat, Chris appeared out of nowhere. He was with his usual group of friends, laughing and talking loud, but his eyes locked onto Trey's, and Trey knew this was no accident. Chris was looking for trouble. Hey, Matthews, Chris called out, his voice carrying across the room. Don't you know that seat's taken? You're going to have to find somewhere else to sit, buddy. The room went quiet, but Trey didn't look away. Normally, he would have backed down, moved on, just avoided it. But something about Chris's tone made him snap. Trey stopped walking, took a deep breath, and squared his shoulders. He had to do this. He couldn't let Chris get away with it again. No, Trey said firmly, his voice clearer than he expected. I'm sitting here. Chris's friend snickered, and Chris himself stepped closer, looming over Trey with a cocky grin. What did you say? Chris sneered. You think you can just talk to me like that? For a split second, Trey hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest, and the weight of his own fear seemed to choke him. But then he remembered Olivia's words. He wasn't alone. He had his voice, and he was going to use it. I said I'm sitting here, Trey repeated, more confidently this time. The cafeteria was dead silent now, everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Trey's mind was racing, but his body stood firm. He could feel the stares, the eyes of every student around him, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time, he wasn't worried about the consequences. For the first time, Trey Matthews wasn't afraid of standing up for himself. Chris's smile faltered, and his eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to people defying him. But instead of taking a swing at Trey, or trying to back him down, something unexpected happened. Chris stepped back, his posture stiffening. Whatever, man, he muttered, and with a huff, he turned and walked off with his crew. The room slowly filled with a buzz of murmurs. Trey stood there, breathing heavily, still unsure of what had just happened. But when he looked around, he saw something unexpected. People weren't laughing at him. They were watching him, nodding, some even smiling. Trey's heart swelled. He had done it. He had stood up for himself. Olivia appeared beside him, her face lighting up in a proud smile. I knew you had it in you, she said softly. Trey didn't know what to say. For the first time in so long, he didn't feel small. He felt seen. He felt strong. And even though the day wasn't over and Chris might come back at him with something worse tomorrow, Trey knew one thing. He had taken the first step. He was done hiding. The next few days were different. Trey didn't expect everything to change overnight, but he noticed something new in the way people looked at him. It wasn't the same. The whispers weren't as harsh. and the stares didn't feel as judgmental. He wasn't invisible anymore. Chris, however, didn't take the encounter lying down. He tried to make things awkward between them in class, sneering when Trey passed him in the hall, even spreading rumors about him. But Trey no longer cared. He could feel the shift in himself, in the way his shoulders squared up when he walked into a room. For the first time, he wasn't afraid to hold his ground. One afternoon after school, as Trey was walking home, he noticed something. The neighborhood was still the same. Kids on bikes, cars rushing past, the sound of life moving around him. But there was a new feeling in there. Trey had learned to tune it all out, to live in his head, but that evening, something clicked. He looked around and realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been giving too much power to the voices that told him he wasn't enough. He had the strength to silence those voices himself. He just had to use it. He remembered the way Olivia had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. It felt like a small seed of confidence, something fragile but real. And he knew he had to protect it. The next day at school, Trey was ready for whatever came his way. Chris tried again, making sure to throw snide remarks in front of Trey's classmates. But Trey didn't flinch. He didn't back down. This time, when Chris stepped into his space, Trey calmly looked him in the eye and said, "You're not the one who decides what I'm worth." The words were simple, but they carried power. For the first time, Trey realized that standing up for himself wasn't just about fighting back. It was about refusing to let people define who he was. Chris scoffed and walked away. His crew tried to laugh it off, but there was something in Trey's expression that made it clear. This wasn't a game anymore. He wasn't going to let them win. As the weeks went by, the bullying didn't completely stop, but it became less frequent. Chris started to back off, and others who had once avoided Trey began to take notice. It wasn't because Trey had suddenly turned into someone else. It was because he had finally stopped letting the world dictate how he saw himself. He had started defining himself on his own terms. One day after class, Olivia caught up to him. "You've changed," she said, her smile warm but knowing. "You're different now, Trey." He smiled back. "Yeah, I guess I am." It wasn't perfect. There would still be days when the weight of the world felt like it was on his shoulders. But now Trey knew that he didn't have to carry it alone. He had his voice, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away. For the first time, Trey Matthews felt free.